Have worked on these very important topics in various climes. And today we have Mr. Logan Watt, who is the Executive Director of the African Tax Administration Forum. Join us. Let's put our hands together for Mr. Logan Watt as he makes his way to the stage. Let me also invite Mr. Alvin Mosioma. Alvin Mosioma is the Executive Director of TGNA, Tax Justice Network Africa. Let's put our hands together for Alvin. And over the next 1.5 hours, we would have an opportunity to interact with the panel on the topic of discussion. All right, so let me take the cue from you. Let's do this. Professor.
Thank you very much. Good morning. How are you this morning? How was tea? It was good? We're not sleepy, are we? Very good. Well, thank you very much, Alvin and Logan, for being here. We've had very beautiful discussions, since the Gender Pre-Forum, where we looked into how we can really fight corruption in Africa. And we've looked at involving all stakeholders relevant, the youth, people living with disability, women, how to involve everyone. Now, the past 2 days at the high-level dialogue, we've looked at topics like, what should Africa do to win the fight against corruption? We looked at the political economy of corruption. We looked at sustainable approaches to the fight against corruption. We looked at building collective consciousness for the fight against corruption. We've looked at bridging the gap amongst key actors for the fight against corruption, and now we're looking at partnerships and cooperation for the fight against corruption. And taking what my Director General from the DCC said the other day, that our logo in Botswana is a spider web. And it means that corruption and fighting it is very complex. It means also that it takes complex approaches, and it requires complex, or at least actors who understand things at a complex level. And in understanding that, it brings down the issue of finances and how expensive corruption is, or how the fight against corruption is expensive. Now, coming down to Africa and how we've depended on aid for such a long time, and talking about taxation, can we really move beyond aid and mobilize resources through taxation? Do we have fair tax systems? Do we manage them well enough to collect revenue? And how do we deal with illicit financial flows, where we lose apparently 1 billion a year, where we've lost 50 billion or trillion USD in the past 50 years? How now do we, taking this web of corruption and the fight and the resources we need to bring to the table, how do we deal with issues of taxation? Now, with that, we'll start with Logan, because Logan has this beautiful presentation. It'll take about 10-15 minutes. And I would not want to interrupt him. I would like for us to just listen to what he has to say. And if we have questions, I might ask a question or two. And then from there, I'll give the floor to Alvin to also add in. And then afterwards, we will start with comments. Only those who have comments will have the floor for 2 minutes. And then after everyone has commented, then we will take in questions. I think it will help, even with the rapporteurs, to sort of like separate comments from questions and come up with some solutions moving forward. So I'll give you the floor, Logan. Thank you.
Thank you, Potato, and good afternoon to everybody. Thanks for the opportunity on behalf of we are very pleased to participate in the conference. Earlier, before we started, during the break, Alvin over there and I had a conversation about the fact that we've spent a lot of time on definitions of corruption, and we spent a lot of time on public sector corruption and chasing the traffic cop in addition to some of the other bigger political issues. And I described to him a situation where how a drug deal goes. I'm South African, and South Africa has a number of drug mules in prison around the world, and I'm sure some other countries as well. And typically, the importer the drug bust. While all of them are celebrating, the person with 100 kilograms walks through and the real drug deal takes place. And so one does wonder the extent of the impact of a micro focus in dealing with corruption. One of the things that struck me yesterday was Crystal, who spoke about corruption and the relation of corruption and power structures. And it is clear that where corruption takes place, the basis of that is the power relationship between groups or individuals where this takes place. And the one focus that we need to have is the role of the corporate world. Because if we want to understand the power, well, firstly, if we want to understand the fact or unpack the 65% of illicit financial flows attributed to corporate world, to multinational enterprises, and one understand the power of access, resources, knowledge, skills, and mobility, one can understand how corporate corruption is the business structures. And then I want to come to the role of tax. Corruption in taxation. Corruption in taxation takes place in basic administration that you and I know, in auditing, because a lot of our processes on the continent are manual, because we have an informal economy. Tax is rich people, high net worth individuals in our countries who do not get taxed because they are connected. Politicians who legally do not pay tax because their parliaments allow them not to pay tax. Multinational enterprises, of course, is the biggest form of corruption in the form of tax avoidance and tax evasion. And we will find in a minute that in the extractive industries and through incentives, we lose the biggest form of our income through institutionalized, legal, almost corruption. And then, of course, corruption at customs through customs fraud, under declarations, and over declarations in a system called trade mispricing. So that's the world of taxation and how corruption is possible in a very, very, very basic way. This conference spoke very briefly, one or two people spoke about technology and the use of technology in dealing with this. I'm going to this because part of the battle against corruption is to start getting results and to stop defining. Some of the conversations we've had, we could have had 30 years ago, it would have been the same, because we are still defining what are some of the results and what are some of the opportunities technology brings. And so in taxation, automating tax processes has reduced corruption in those countries like Kenya, like South Africa, like Uganda and Rwanda. It has reduced corruption within tax. Blockchain technology is allowing us to see who owns what assets across the world. And the partnerships you need there comes through a process of automatic exchange of information between countries. And this was seen with the Panama Papers, where people who had money stashed in jurisdictions were exposed. E-filing and the digital economy opening up new tax markets. I think the question is, what does the fourth industrial revolution offer? Is this a threat to Africa or is it an opportunity? The digital economy is opening up new markets where people, especially the youth, a lot of us have spoken about them, the rising African middle class are buying, and they are buying digitally. So where does the proceeds of that economic transaction go? And how will Africa in the new digitalized economy get its share of revenue from digital transactions? That is a big discussion taking place globally. Is Africa there? Will we get our fair share? And then maybe to talk about technology, I'd like to tell you that last week in Uganda we had a very, very interesting meeting on the use of science in taxation. Uganda has established, the Uganda Revenue Authority has established a science lab, and they have over the past few years appointed not accountants, not lawyers, but quantity surveyors and civil engineers and IT people in the tax department. And they have applied science in reducing corruption and tax evasion. And here are some of the results. In construction, they were able to their science lab to deconstruct the components of cement. And through that deconstruction, they were able to turn around a declared loss from a construction company into a profit, because the company was claiming deductions for components in the cement that wasn't there. But because they had technology, they could prove it, and they gained a $5 million tax income. In manufacturing, they were able to, through deconstructing the component of material, change their fortunes to a 9.5 million gain in revenue. The same with a brewery, where they were able to, through IT technology, expose false declarations. They were able to gain 28 billion Uganda shillings from the brewery. So all of these were corrupt transactions. And they didn't have the tax or the financial or the legal knowledge to deal with this based on what was declared to them. They simply tried to use technology and science. It was beautiful to see, and it's working. I think at the level of multinational enterprises, the big issue there is the 65% of illicit financial flows that we get, and a lot of this happens through trade mispricing and transfer pricing, a lot of technical stuff. But essentially, it is hiding profits and shifting profits through intercompany movement of money in a very basic way. Our job is not only to say you are doing it, you are doing it. Our job is to find the mechanisms to expose that. So what have we done? In ATAF, we have developed African standards, how to deal with intercompany transactions. Zambia has adopted the ATAF transfer pricing regulations, and as a result, have just gained $6 million from a company for incorrect filing and declaring falsely. In Nigeria, we have made a simple change to the legislation and simply in the law changed the burden of proof. And that has changed the fortunes of Nigerian income because it has reduced the ability of companies to make false declarations. These are practical examples I want to give you to say that in the end, we must do something. We have just gained over $400 million, $500 million for a West African country through simply adjusting the rules and making it possible. The extractives is a big area of corruption, as you all know. These contracts are not transparent. Incentives are rife in the extractive industry. We in Botswana has more than 90% of its GDP is made from exports. A big part of it is in diamonds. The big losses in the diamond industry are simple to explain. Unlike other metals where you can see the price on a stock exchange, diamonds has 15,000 different places where they make price. In 2013, 6 million carats of diamonds were exported from Africa. These were exported to essentially 5 countries: Israel, Dubai, Brussels, Switzerland, and some other country that can't get to my mind now. Those diamonds were sold to a third party at between 50 and 75% markup. But there was no value added when the diamond left Botswana or Lesotho or Liberia. That same diamond with nothing added, not even a ring attached to it or polished, was sold to the third party at 75% more. Why could Botswana or Lesotho or Liberia not get that 75% in the first place? That's corporate corruption. And so, when we talk about the extractive industry, we're not only talking about smuggling, we're not only talking about bad contracts, we're also talking about corrupt practices relating to fair price. So let me maybe start concluding by talking about social cohesion and the role of tax compliance. Tax revenues, when it's used for social and public good, cements the contract between the state and citizens. And tax revenue is supposed to be that important tool that allows for income redistribution in unequal societies. Sadly, on our continent, we do not see that instrument being used as one that tries to equalize the society. When we have a compliance culture, a good tax compliance culture, people are less likely to be corrupt. When tax money is spent to the benefit of people and people can see the wealth and the health created by their tax money, the need to be corrupt and to get things by alternative means reduces. And so spending tax money well is a good instrument against corruption. Finally, talking about cooperation, there's 2 parts of cooperation that we must consider. One is in-country cooperation. A big part of dealing with corruption, other people have said, is interagency cooperation, where banks, the central bank, employers, the statistics office, the trade office, where these people work together and they share information and you can follow money and you have regulations in place. For taxation and for financial regulations, there's a lot of third-party data available. When you swipe a credit card, when you get a salary, when you buy an air ticket, that data allows you to see who does what. And in countries where these systems work together, you are probably able to reduce corruption considerably. And then, of course, agreements between countries, whether these are tax treaties, mutual assistance agreements, or simply extradition agreements. Those are partnerships that are essential to fight corruption. I thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Logan. I just have a quick question. In situations where you find that, let's take the cooperation to the international level, where MNEs or MNCs from a particular country operate, say, in Botswana, and you have a particular donor funding, say, civil society organization on transparency or accountability area. And then you have this company from that country also, say, contravening certain tax laws by avoidance or even evasion. How do you then work on how do you ensure that governments, say in the diplomatic corps, work out ensuring that the MNCs or MNEs pay their taxes and still, I guess, finding a balance into concessions and I guess diplomacy? How do you do that?
Thank you so much. There's a couple of contradictions in that relationship. One, the agency that supports you financially from that country often in most cases, don't want to pay tax themselves. You show me any of your funders, institutional funders, who pays tax in your country. They themselves don't. One. Two, I think we need to separate, again coming to the power structures, we need to separate the interest of the state of that country and the business. The business is a business, and the nature of corporate life and the nature of the capitalist structure is to maximize profit by any means. And so the role of the state is to facilitate trade. And so the instruments by which the state facilitates trade, let's say Botswana and China, is the nature of the relationship of agreements that they have to enable that trade. And it is what you put in those agreements that allows the states, that forces states to act. And those agreements are not only trade agreements, but are tax treaties, are exchange of information agreements. So if there are these agreements, then you and the developed country, and now I'm talking about Europe and the US and so on, you have access to the corporate information of the multinational enterprise, both in the main country and you as the receiving of the investment country. You're not going to find a situation where the government is going to morally act against the company. You're also not going to find a situation where the supporting development institution from that country is going to tackle the M&E without legal instruments in place. Because these things don't happen as political campaigns. These things happen on the basis of rules, regulations, and laws that exist. And part of what African countries are increasingly doing, and that we must do, is to defend our economies against these corrupt practices by having the proper treaties in place. That allows it.
Thank you very much. And the reason I'm asking this question, I think coming from a civil society point, is that we always point fingers that, you know, we have, say, illicit financial flows that are, you know, usually done, or the partakers of it are companies that operate in our countries with these trade agreements that our governments facilitate. So how do we then, say, advocate and fight for, say, tax justice, or even stopping tax incentives when our governments have these trade agreements? So I think from civil society point, it's like there's, I think going back to cooperation and even in partnerships, I think governments also explaining or making citizens and even civil society aware of certain decisions that they make might actually help our work in fighting corruption and how we fight it. Because sometimes we fight their own battles that we shouldn't even be fighting because of certain things. So that's why I was asking that question, that understanding that might actually also help us in civil society field know exactly what to do. So Alvin, I'll give the floor to you. I don't know if you have anything to say in response to what Logan has said thus far.
Yes, thank you. Since Logan had not given me a total brief of his presentation, I'll try to cut through some of the points that I wanted to raise, which makes the submissions that I'll make a little bit briefer. Is it good afternoon? Yes, good afternoon, everyone. Alvin Musioma are my names from the Tax Justice Network Africa. Now, I've been looking at the Corruption Perception Index. And you look at that index, it has got, at least the 2017 one, it has got two main columns of the most clean countries and the most highly corrupt. They don't call them the dirtiest, but they call them the highly corrupt countries. And among the top 10, you have Switzerland, Singapore, Luxembourg, Netherlands, the UK being the most clean. And you have, among the most highly corrupt, you have countries like Angola, Equatorial Guinea, Guinea-Bissau, South Sudan, Somalia, largely countries of the South. That got me depressed. Then I looked at the Paradise Papers. For those of you that have looked at that, or the Panama Papers. And there it tells you a different picture. That the money that is stolen from the so-called highly corrupt countries is hidden in jurisdictions of the countries that are perceived and considered to be highly clean countries, which for me is the heart of the conversation we should be having here. How we define and perceive corruption matters. It matters because of the kind of discussions we have. We have been having, to a bigger part, a micro-focused conversation that largely focuses or places developing countries and African countries, for that matter, at the bottom of the scale of corruption and leaving out the pervasive role that the rich countries play in facilitating and enabling the vices in poor countries. The role that accounting firms and lawyers play is, I think, an important one. So as we unpack this animal called corruption, it's really, really important to have both an historical understanding, but also a structural understanding of how we locate the concept of corruption and how we unpack it. And for me, one thing that I would like to emphasize, I think that we need really to do away with the Corruption Perception Index, because it has become like a beauty pageant of a particular notion of how we define corruption, and based on that, we are defining which countries are more corrupt and which are not. Building up on what Logan was saying, I would like to share a few facts. We already know of the 65% of the contribution of illicit financial flows to the total outflows of resources from the continent. Commercial tax evasion and tax avoidance contributes to the largest component of the hemorrhaging of the resources from the continent, and yet we are spending a big part of our time discussing the stealing and the petty corruption that is still a problem. But the elephant in the room is commercial tax evasion and tax avoidance. And I think, in my humble submission, that's where the debate should be. 60% of global trade is channeled through tax havens. Over 60% of international trade is between interrelated companies. It is not a surprise that Switzerland is the largest trader on copper, although we know where that copper is mined. When we discuss corruption, are we yet to see a day when the heads of multinational companies that have been responsible for shifting profits using weak laws in our national system, using undermining or using double tax agreements, as we have seen in the case of the Panama Papers, to launder or shift profits from developing countries. So in a nutshell, I think that the conversation on corruption will not be complete if we don't try to look at the global and structural dimension of it. Who is setting the rules of the game? Where companies are recording their profits or where they're declaring their profit matters, and it matters from the context of what we know from the Mbeki panel report. Just as a small anecdote, you'd be surprised to know that the largest taxi company does not own a vehicle, nor does the largest provider of accommodation services does not own buildings. This is Uber and Airbnb. We live in a world that is, as Logan was saying, is digitalized, a digital economy. Capital does not have a home. What this means in terms of resource mobilization, in terms of the capacity of revenue authorities to capture the revenues that are generated by activities that are happening in our own jurisdictions, but profits are being declared in other jurisdictions, I think is a conversation that we need to have. Double tax treaties, I think Logan did allude to that. The essence of double tax treaties is to allow entities that are operating in two jurisdictions not to pay tax twice. But what we have seen, particularly with tax treaties that are signed with jurisdictions that are considered to be tax havens, is a situation where companies are avoiding paying tax twice, double non-taxation. They are not paying tax where they are operating, and they are not paying tax where they are registered as residents. And in this particular case, even some of our African countries are playing this role, particularly here, the role that Mauritius does play as a conduit for investment to many African countries and undermining the tax basis of many African countries, I think is a frank conversation that we need to have. Lastly, in terms of collaboration, I think that the starting point is we can only structure the collaboration dependent on how we understand the problem. And looking at the supply side of corruption, looking at not only focusing at the demand side, but the supply side of corruption, means that we need to look at both the global spaces where the rules are being made, the role, for example, that OECD is playing in designing the global rules. We need to look at regional processes. As you might be aware, there is the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa in collaboration with ETAF and other organizations, including Tax Justice Network Africa, have been over the last 5 years working together and sharing intel and collaborating together in terms of sharing expertise and collaborating in different activities to try and support each other's work. And I think when we talk of collaboration, this is something that I find absolutely important. And lastly, Logan didn't mention the importance of intra-country collaboration, which is key between the different oversight institutions. What we see is more of a competition, or the left hand not knowing what the right hand is doing. One department of government pushing for tax incentives, while the other government is trying to rationalize tax incentives, for example. When it comes to access for information, what information is available to revenue authorities in terms of taxpayers, and what is available with the anti-corruption entities. I'll stop there and we can go to questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alvin. Talking about collaborations and partnerships, it makes me think of principles of transparency and openness. And going down to, say, the local level, we can argue that at times it's difficult for even organizations to collaborate between themselves, because it requires one to be open about what they are doing, and also pulling together and finding common goals. And it has been difficult for, say, NGOs to work together at some point, or even to be transparent. How do you then deal with, say, intra-agency collaborations or partnerships when that requires openness and transparency in the long run, and even accountability in the long run?
Our experience is that people relate to each other, countries relate to each other, organizations relate to each other, if there is a direct benefit or a direct result out of that relationship. And often if we are in a similar sphere and we use third-party research and data like the high-level panel, 50 billion everywhere, then there's nothing really we can talk to each other about, because we're talking to each other about other people's research and other people's statistics. But if we work in civil society and we enable ourselves to do our own research, to develop our own data, because our countries on the continent often lacks data. Governments, national statistics departments do not necessarily collect the relevant data that empowers domestic defense of the economy. But civil society can do that. And so and you're asking about the civil society collaboration question, I think one of the things that should be encouraged among civil society, especially on the continent, is that we go beyond the interpretation of analysis of African situations by others. That we develop our own research capability, we develop our own statistical capability, and therefore when we come up with anti-corruption or gender or any other type of policy solution, it is based on true African conditions. Because part of the weakness of the state is a weakness of knowledge and skill. And the state won't acknowledge it. It will just become draconian to try and obfuscate the fact that they don't have that. And civil society is not necessarily in opposition to the state. And so when civil society organizations start to cooperate on programs and projects that has result, you will find that collaboration becomes a lot easier.
Yeah, I think that when you talk of transparency in general, there is a strong focus on public sector transparency, on how transparent are governments, which I think is an important aspect. But equally, if not more important, is corporate transparency. How open and transparent are the corporate sector in terms of their activities? And here, the conversations we've been having, for example, on beneficial ownership. You can't tax what you don't know. If there's an entity that is being registered in one jurisdiction operating under a different name in another jurisdictions, when it comes to the question of asset tracking for tax purposes, becomes a very difficult exercise. So I think that we need to shed equal light on corporate transparency to ensure that globally there is, and this is an area I think that our national governments have a huge opportunity when it comes to tackling illicit financial flows by institutionalizing or putting in place policies and legislation that ensures that you have a public registry on beneficial ownership. Who's the actual owner? If you look at, for example, the case we had in Panama Papers, it's very difficult for an anti-corruption official to move from one jurisdiction to the other. By the time you are landing in Cayman Island, that company has re-registered again and is called another different in another different jurisdiction. So the focus on not only on public sector but also on corporate sector transparency, I think, is a very important one.
Thank you very much for actually bringing up the issue of beneficial ownership, because I guess different countries would have this problem where a company would come from outside, invest in your country, have different shareholders, stakeholders, not pay tax. After 2 years, it's a different name. But then how do you now link corporate integrity or even corporate transparency in the fight against corruption to what government does, taking into consideration this whole liberalization and the free hand, the invisible hand in the market? How do you balance the two?
Part of the work that we do in ATAF is to help to first ourselves try and understand how company structures work, and then use that knowledge to build in regulations and legislation for our member countries on the continent, and then to help train the auditors that must find this. So an example is a 900 million, in this case South Africa, so it was a rand assessment on one individual taxpayer. This taxpayer declared 60,000 rand income for about 10 years. And when the Revenue Authority started following this up, through the process of what Alvin describes as beneficial ownership, they could discover that the person owned 36 companies across the world, including a football team in England, a yacht, an aeroplane, the works, but declared 60,000 rand, and half of the businesses registered on his mother's name. Through a network of internal financial regulations that countries must have, and a network of treaties with, in this case, France and England and South Africa, they were able to trace all of those companies through a beneficial ownership structure to one person, 36 companies. And as a result, rich people have money and they can afford lawyers. It took 10 years for them to get that 900 million rand, but they got it in the end. And so part of that defense was a network of treaties and the knowledge to understand ownership structures and how one company can lend money to another company and claim tax benefits from that borrowing, and that other company which belongs to the same person gets tax benefits because they're now in debt. So if you don't understand these structures, the same company or the same individual can make a profit from tax, because the one company lends to, the other one borrows from. So the one lending to declares a lesser profit. The one borrowing from gets a tax break from debt. And they all belong to the same people. And so they've made a profit. So unless, and that's corruption.
Yeah.
But unless our economies and our tax authorities, our finance ministries, and the president of the country understands this, we're not going to act against it.
So it will take different actors really understanding the tax structures, ownership structures, and how the web actually becomes a web and how to eventually cut it. Meaning our parliamentarians also need to understand at least a little bit of what really goes on. Our cabinet they need to understand what happens. So now how do we ensure that this happens without, I'm sure it will come from civil society, I guess. Somebody has to, or from academia, or professionals. How do we push for that? How do we push for that knowledge and that education without seemingly aggressive, or without aggression in a way, or without seeming to be invading public space?
Okay, thank you. I think that in this particular case, we definitely have to be aggressive. But let me add something else from what Logan was saying. In addition to beneficial ownership legislation, for tax authorities, I think another important component is how they access that information from another jurisdiction. At the moment, for many African countries, if you don't have a tax agreement, a tax exchange agreement, becomes very, very difficult to track that information. So mechanisms for exchanging of tax information on automatic basis, I think is another area that I think will be important. Now, in addition to the question you asked about the role of the different actors, I think Parliament here has a key role to play, and I'm happy that, for instance, that the Africa Tax Administrators Forum have started engaging the Pan-Africa Parliament, which I think is an important platform at regional collaboration. But at national level, the public accounts committees have a very important role to play in even sometimes summoning some of these heads. We have seen this in other jurisdictions, calling out on some of these practices by some of these actors. You saw recently, Mark Zuckerberg was summoned by the Congress to come and answer some of the activities of his companies. We have seen this happen to Apple. We have seen this happen to Amazon, where the heads of these companies are being summoned by Parliament. And I think that our parliaments need to get more active. They have these opportunities, but many of them are not taking those opportunities seriously. In Kenya, there was a treaty that was passed between Mauritius, a double tax agreement. And the law or the constitution says that a double tax agreement must be ratified by Parliament. This is what the law says, but this treaty was passed and ratified without the involvement of the Kenyan legislature. And I think this is where, as much as we talk of capacity, there are particular opportunities that our different institutions have that they need to take advantage of.
Okay, now, so let's say we follow the money. And thank you, Hamzat from Code. Thank you very much. I love your work. I love what you do. So now let's say you follow the money and you trace this track in the web and you find the owner of the company, for example, or the owners of companies. How do we then, what must we do to strengthen asset recovery, or even the money being repatriated back into Africa or into African countries? How do we do that, and what must citizens know? What do we need to know as citizens to help our governments in asset recovery?
I think Alvin can come in on that one, but I have lots of sympathy to the gentleman, I think he's from Tunisia, who was explaining the frustration of their former head of state and trying to repatriate. So as much as we speak about the protection of having the legislative and the rule system in place, in most cases that is not enough. And again, coming back to power and power structures. Because one of the biggest problems the continent has is, I think the Nigerians are still trying to get Sani Abacha's stolen millions back. The Tunisians are trying theirs. This is a political area. I hope I'm not offending anyone, but I'm sure the Libyans are also looking for their money, etc., etc. And those are the ones we know about. There are other countries that we never speak about where there's stolen money everywhere. And so you may have the legislation in place. Obviously, the first line of defense is to have extradition treaties, repatriation agreements, and all sorts of things. But if they give them citizenship and start protecting citizens, then you start wondering, because if you do that, they will sanction you. They will boycott you. They will stop trade to you. They will basically drive you to your knees until you hand over whoever they need. That's what they'll do to you. It's a power relationship. And I don't know what the answer is to dealing with a country that is stronger than you, because one of the issues around in our world is that one of the protections of our tax base lies in the content of a tax treaty. But Africa has the least tax treaties with the rest of the world because nobody is interested to have tax treaties with Africa, because the absence of that allows them to do what they want. But African countries don't have the economic or political power to enforce or to demand this. So I don't want to say it's a situation of hopelessness, It is a situation that you've got to have your first line of defense, where you've got to have extradition treaties, you've got to have the legal framework in place, and then you've got to have the foreign relationship to do that. But I guess, you know, the biggest part of this is how Africa manages its brand. Because if we are branded as a bunch of corrupt people, incorrectly so, if we are branded as a bunch of people they can do anything with, if our leaders set the example of buckling to every phone call they get to join any convention, whether it makes sense for them or not, nobody needs to respect you. We all come from families and communities where we see what happens to people that the community don't respect. They don't listen to them. And that often is the case with an African country. You can be within your right, but if collectively we behave in a way that people can do to us what we want to, I guess the biggest sense of protection is that whether we're civil society or whether we're political leaders, we must take ourselves seriously first.
Thank you very much. Alvin, do you have something to add to that?
The only way you can take advantage of your individual national level weakness is in collaboration and organizing. And I think this is where convening such as the AU becomes important, but they are falling short of that. I think that there have been efforts even within the high-level panel process of trying to see what tools can African countries put in place to speak in one voice. But then, as Logan says, you enter into that space, you're only defending Kenyan interests, you're defending Nigerian interests, and it becomes really, really difficult. So how we put our own house in order matters, and I think that's the point that Logan is emphasizing.
I think will be, I guess, referring to you a lot. He said something about you cannot expect a lizard to be a crocodile or something. So, and then you bring up the issue of helplessness, that, you know, we cannot really fight. How do you even know? Maybe it's an issue of negotiation. Would you say we do not know how to negotiate well, or we know it's just that we are restricted in negotiating treaties? And like, what is the issue really? Because understanding the core, the essence of the issue might help us, you know, moving forward and figuring out the partnerships we make and the cooperation, or even enhance our collaborations when it comes to tax treaties and the tax systems that we have in place, and even following the money. Yeah.
I don't know. I think a big part for me personally is we must have the conviction to act. And I don't think, you know, with our esteemed bodies, including the African Union and others, we are showing the conviction to act. You know, last year or 2 years ago, the world introduced in taxation a system called exchange of information between countries, and encouraged countries to join this thing, and it allows you to, as Alvin explained, to get information. And this was a kind of globally negotiated thing. Out of the blue, the US announces a domestic rule called the Financial Action Transaction Compliance, FATCA. Yeah, I'm trying to give you a name, FATCA. They imposed that on the whole world. It was no agreement, no UN, no OECD, no discussion with everybody, and they simply said, if you don't sign, we will hold back 30% of whatever money must come to your country and our country, just like that. Basically saying, what are you going to do? Now they've got probably, again, power structures, they've got the power to do it, but they acted in a way that protected them. And so sometimes we're not going to catch the big fish, you know, like the proceeds of Sani Abacha or the Tunisian former head of state. But if we have the courage of our conviction to deal with multinationals in our own country, to deal with those on our soil within the laws and the provisions, and we've heard that here in Botswana and other places, all those laws are there. If we have the courage of our conviction to use it with citizens and non-citizens all the time, transparently and publicly, then those that from whom we want extradition and return of money will understand the seriousness. And so sometimes we can't get the 100-kilogram drug dealer, but let's catch and convict the 2-kilogram carrier so that the message and the intention is clear, and that sense of hopelessness fades. Because sometimes we become hopeless because we want to go for the European and the American and the big macro, and we don't deal with the micro corruption and crime under our noses. These things add up. And in taxation over the past 10 years of ATAF existence, we have found that however small, $200,000 a year, $1 million, getting back for Zimbabwe or Nigeria or Liberia, it adds up to a culture where, in the long run, revenue in all of those countries have increased, not because we help them audit, but because the message is out that we will deal with those who don't pay, and we have increased our capability. So that sense of hopelessness doesn't have to be there. We, civil society, government, and others must stop being scared to deal with corporate corruption. And that's the issue.
Thank you very much, Alvin.
Yeah, I think that there are things that governments can definitely do at the national level. As much as we recognize that there's a global power imbalance, and by the way, it does not just apply to tax, it applies to trade, it applies to all other areas. As much as we recognize that, there are also particular opportunities that we have. Recently, Rwanda, I think in April, passed a legislation saying any transactions that companies are carrying out on management fee, they put a rate of 2%. You can't charge more than 2% of your management fee. And of course, the message that usually passes is that if you pass such kind of legislation, investors are going to pack and go. We didn't see that happen. So I think the courage that Logan is speaking about is what is required. In some areas, you look at, for example, again, coming back to double tax agreement, these are negotiated treaties within countries. So it is, if you are negotiating a treaty with Mauritius, it's you to make a decision. Are you making the taxation of royalties at 5 or 10%? It is your own decision to protect your own tax base. But at the same time, I think we also need to recognize that the global, there are global rules that we need to be in those spaces where those global rules are being done, and try to influence that. And we can only be there not as individual countries, but as a collective. And that's, I think, the power of organizing that we are, again, not taking advantage of equitably.
Thank you. Speaking of global rules brings me to collaborations and partnerships at the international level. And then it brings me to the issue of donors. I guess we are, in a way, concurring that we can move Africa beyond aid through tax revenue mobilization. But in the meantime, while we're still working towards that, what about donor funding? And I mean, I've heard during the week where we kind of feel a little reserved when we talk about certain projects being funded by donors, for example, or foreign donors. So I'd just like for you to just speak on that when we talk about partnerships and collaborations, how we can sit okay, in a way, with funding from outside of Africa in the projects that we do in the fight against corruption, and without making it an excuse to not work. So Alvin, I'll start with you.
Wow. What's the question again?
Donors. It's like there's a certain shame in our meetings about using donor funding for our projects. But in the meantime, we're still trying to figure out how to collect our revenues and be independent from donor, from aid. But somehow there's always this impression that we would really rather not have even in the room, we'd rather not have donors in the room, but then we also talk about partnerships and collaborations.
Okay.
So at the global level, how do we balance that?
Wow.
Yes.
I think the term donors, of course, is a very political term. It's a very, it needs to be unpacked when we talk of donors as such, because, and also contextualized. If there are, for example, if you look at emergency services, in the area of emergency in Yemen and other areas, and there are resources that are being directed in those countries, it's a different context. Or if you look at resources that are coming to civil society organizations, if you look at resources that are going to government. So I think that we need to unpack so that we are not making sweeping statements. Secondly, I think that there is a role that what you can call North-South collaboration can play. I don't think that we need to have a dichotomy approach saying, the North on one side and the South. There is a lot of value added in supporting North-South collaboration, but also South-South collaboration, because ultimately when you see the problems that we are trying to address, be they the challenges of inequality, they affect humanity as such. So that's the prism that I look at it. The challenge that I think where this partnership can be a problem is when it is coming, number one, with strings attached, with particular conditionalities that are aimed at achieving particular political or economic objectives. Then I think that's where we need to be. But also you have to be aware of that yourself, because sometimes you are not conscious of that. That's one area. So the second point I think is, for example, in the tax arena, there has been a lot of focus on capacity building, particularly just to give that as an example, where there has been a lot of international support going into supporting particularly tax administration across the continent and then you find that it's being skewed if you look at the support that is going to tax administration versus what is going to support the legislative process versus what is going, there's a skew there. So I think that how those resources come in, how they are allocated, and how they are complementing whatever already is existing on the ground is what matters. I would not want to have it from that perspective of kind of a general sweeping statements that this is donor money and therefore it comes compromised. I think that you're using one very, very generalized statements, and those largely can be very untrue. Yeah.
Yes, picking up from Alvin, the success in using donor funds is how you use it. And so you can use it for capacity building, but if you define capacity building as a 1-week workshop where you fly everybody in, put them in the hotel, give them per diem, they don't always attend the sessions and they go home, that's wasted donor money. Or you can use donor money in a sustainable way and say capacity building is not a 1-week workshop. So capacity building or using donor money to build institutions, to build technical capability, to build data and research functions, to build something that when the donor money dries up, there's something behind that has your own capabilities now. Then you've used donor money smartly. We will, for a long time on the continent, need donor money. But it's a reciprocal relationship. You can be ideological about it. Because in as much as we say that it is ideological, they want to dictate, they want to do this, they want to do that, we're not going to run our programs because we do not generate the requisite domestic revenue to fund our own stuff yet. Donors have an interest in this. They've got not just a philanthropic interest, they also have an interest, I believe, in funding our programs because they have an interest in a better run Africa. Because they don't want the boats to come over there from the north to Spain every day. And so they've got an interest in a well-developed, a well-established continent as well. And so whatever politics you want to put to it, the fact is we need that partnership. And the challenge is to use the donor money in a sustainable way. In ATAF, we have a principle that says when people get things for free, they don't appreciate it. And so the way we use donor money, just as an example, is as a rule, we don't pay flights, accommodation, and per diem to people to come to our programs. You pay your flights and per diem and stuff yourself. And you find that you find the right people coming to the programs. They're at the programs all of the time, and they go and they give back because they paid to get there. There are times when you have to bend that rule, but as a principle, that's what you do. So using donor money properly is to your advantage, and then you can deal with the ideology of it. Because you must then be smart. If the donor money comes with a condition that is not in your interest, you must be strong enough to walk away from it. And that's part of the discipline and the culture I think we must have.
Well, thank you very much. We have talked for about 1 hour. Thank you for the conversation, but I'd like to include everyone in the house looking at illicit financial flows, how to enhance asset recovery mechanisms or efforts in fighting corruption, looking at collaborations and partnerships that we need to form. I give those who have comments for now, just comments only, 2 minutes maximum, comments only. I will start with Reke Laotswe in front here, and the gentleman from Libya, and Sansad, and yes, and the gentleman in blue for now. Just comments, only comments, if you have comments. C'est le commentaire? Ou question? Comments, okay, cool. So we'll start here.
Thank you, Madam Moderator, for giving me the floor. As already indicated, my name is Shimane Laotswe, and I'm the Charge d'Affaires of the Embassy of the Republic of Botswana in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. And many thanks to the panelists, for their inspiring presentations. Madam Moderator, just a comment to underscore the fact that, in our efforts towards fighting the scourge of corruption in Africa, we really need to underscore the imperative for all of us to pledge our fidelity, collective fidelity of commitment towards the war on corruption. While signing and ratification of conventions and charters on corruption are desirable, they are not panacea to rid Africa of the scourge of corruption. And this view is born out of the fact that there are a lot of countries who are party to these conventions, but unfortunately, of these countries are the biggest culprits of corruption. So for us here, as we talk, we can, of course, emphasize the fact that we need to ratify these various conventions on corruption. But the most important, the fundamental, is practical action in all our countries to rid the African continent of the scourge of corruption. I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Reke Laotswe. So pledges, maybe we need, moving from here, have people pledging on what they're going to do, from civil society to government to private sector, if we have any here, pledging integrity pacts, for example, and what you're going to do, concrete steps on how you're going to do it. Thank you very much. Another comment from the gentleman over there.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. Thank you for the presenters for this productive, insightful presentations and thoughtful. I think it's very interesting to listen all to this, but we can't just take the floor and request every single word because we have to listen more than to talk. Thank you for this. I think corruption should be forbidden not just from the law book, but also from the heart and mind of people and what we are and we try to help in this regard. As we talk about partnership, I think it's important to say that partnership should be responsible, should be sustainable, and should participate in mobilization and sensibilization the public opinion, whether this partnership between institutions, between individuals and private sector, and so on. As we talk about the role of the civil society, I think it's an important, but also what's important, as one of the panels talk about the donations, the source of civil societies. The source of civil society is important because then we look at what they are doing and in which sector they are involved and so on. The most important comment I would like, if this high-level dialogue highlighted as a recommendation, that everyone speak about the single voice, but the single voice should translate to common position for Africa, especially on stolen money, hiding money, and especially the issue of money under the international sanctions. The case now, it's try one single country to put hand on this money under the international sanctions, especially the benefit. So we highly recommend if this high-level meeting dialogue to come out with such recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, thank you. You are eating on your 2 minutes.
Merci, Madame la modératrice. Je voudrais tout d'abord féliciter les deux communicateurs pour leur brillant exposé. D'abord, je vais aller répondre directement à vos questions. Ce sont des contributions. Alors, je voudrais dire que la coopération et le partenariat commencent à l'intérieur des pays africains d'abord, entre la société civile luttant dans le cadre de la lutte contre la corruption et les institutions mises en place par les États. Dans ce cadre, si cela n'est pas fait, eh bien, il sera difficile d'avancer. Ensuite, comme mon prédécesseur l'a dit tout à l'heure, il faut ratifier les conventions et les protocoles de l'Union africaine dans ce cadre-là. Sinon, nous ne pourrions pas discuter sur l'échiquier international. Le deuxième aspect, comment se passer de l'aide extérieure. Cela est possible. Je vous donne un exemple. Dans notre région, 10% de la population paye les impôts et les taxes. Alors, si vous voulez constituer votre budget, c'est sur quelle base? C'est sur la base des ressources naturelles. Et cela n'est pas suffisant. Et les parlements, lors du vote de la loi des finances, font un budget national et un autre budget, une partie qui doit être comblée par la communauté internationale qu'on appelle complément budgétaire. On pourrait se passer de ce complément budgétaire si les citoyens s'acquittaient de leurs impôts et de leurs taxes. Mais là aussi, il y a un problème. Le problème devient politique. C'est par la volonté politique que cela peut se résoudre parce que les hommes politiques ne veulent pas soumettre les populations à ces taxes parce que ce sont leurs électeurs. Et ça constitue des problèmes. Maintenant, en ce qui concerne le code minier dans notre région, vous savez, la région sahélo-saharienne est très riche aussi en ressources minières. Mais lorsque vous regardez, le code minier de ces pays, c'est plein de lacunes. Et les capitalistes ou les exploitants en profitent. Et les populations ne gagnent absolument rien, et les États non plus, bien sûr. Donc ça, c'est un problème aussi. Il faut harmoniser. Il faut qu'il y ait quelque chose au niveau de l'Union africaine. J'ai eu, en tout cas, l'honneur d'assister à une de ces discussions au niveau des chefs d'État, mais il y a eu beaucoup d'États réfractaires qui ne voulaient pas de ça. Ils voulaient être autonomes parce qu'ils sont... Voilà. Maintenant, si vous me permettez, la dernière partie...
Vous avez déjà 4 minutes.
Oui, une minute. C'est sur la récupération des fonds. La récupération des fonds, si vous passez par la justice, vous n'aurez rien. Vous n'aurez que 25%. En disant qu'un tel chef d'État a placé de l'argent à l'extérieur, nous voulons récupérer. Je vais aller schématiquement. Ça ne se passe pas comme ça. Ça se passe par la voie diplomatique. Comme c'est ici, les intéressés, je pourrais discuter avec eux. Parce que certains pays sont passés par cette voie pour récupérer à peu près 75% de leur argent au lieu de 25%. Je pourrais leur expliquer ça en off. Donc, voilà en quelque sorte ma contribution. Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Merci beaucoup. Merci. Oui, monsieur.
Merci, Madame. Dans le prolongement de ce qui vient d'être développé par mes prédécesseurs, je reviens sur la question fondamentale des transferts illicites de l'Afrique vers l'extérieur. Et je crois que s'il faut prioriser nos actions, il faut aller à l'essentiel. Parce que proportionnellement, je pense que les flux illicites de capitaux constituent une part la plus importante du système de recyclage de la corruption. Ça, c'est le premier aspect. Le deuxième aspect, c'est que la corruption au plan interne, selon la volonté des États, ils peuvent agir. Ils ont un système judiciaire qui, plus ou moins, ils peuvent toujours quand même arriver à des solutions. Mais lorsqu'il y a le prolongement au plan international, là, ça devient plus compliqué. Parce que les rapports de force entre les pays du Sud et les pays du Nord sont en notre défaveur. Dès que vous avez un problème, même lorsque vous avez les preuves, vous avez situé où se situent les fonds, il vous est difficile de récupérer même une infime proportion. Parce que le système financier est dominé par ceux du Nord. Donc le problème qui peut se poser, comment arriver à des relations vertueuses en matière de partenariat avec les gens qui sont les plus forts actuellement. Et là, je crois que les rapports d'État à État ne donnent pas suffisamment de résultats, parce que nous sommes dans un système pratiquement d'échange ou de position inégale. Et cela est en défaveur de nos pays africains. Moi, la question que je me pose, et là, je crois qu'on va profiter de la présence de Madame la commissaire politique de l'Union africaine pour dire, est-ce que dans les forums qui réunissent l'Union africaine et l'Union européenne, des questions de cette nature sont posées pour éventuellement sortir de cette tête-à-tête, État à État, dans une relation, je dirais, multilatérale, en disant le problème des transferts illicites, le problème des recouvrements, l'Europe doit s'impliquer parce que c'est l'Europe qui est le partenaire le plus direct de l'Afrique. Moi, je pense que c'est une question qu'on doit poser à Madame la Commissaire, si cette question peut être inscrite à l'agenda des réunions, des forums, des grands forums de l'Union européenne et de l'Union africaine. Merci, Madame.
Merci beaucoup. Oui, monsieur.
Thank you, Madam Moderator, and to the panelists for your very insightful comments. I'm Tagbo Akbazwe. The comments from the panelists allude to illicit financial flows from three, which is important to us, from three key channels: trade, financial systems. I think currently there's perhaps no better example of the complexity of this area than the current MTN Central Bank of Nigeria saga that is currently playing out, where the Nigerian government has asked MTN, which is one of Africa's biggest telecom service providers, to pay $2 billion in unpaid tax, to return $8.1 billion in terms of that were illicitly or, well, illegally transferred out of the country through the conversion of loans to preference shares and moving the money out of Nigeria without the right certificates. Central Bank has also charged 4 banks cumulatively that were involved in that transaction with a fine of $16 million, which they've already taken out of their reserves. Now, I think when we look at these issues, when we look at this, the drama that is playing out there with MTN now having taken the Nigerian government to the High Court, etc., I mean, it talks a whole lot about the need for us to have the right institutions, systems, capacity. Some of the claims of the federal government of Nigeria against MTN came from whistleblowers from inside MTN quarters. Also, it talks about political will. The Nigerian government, one of the things that's driving this is that, with the prices of oil in recent times, and also the country having to struggle in terms of resource mobilization, they've started to look inwards, and the area of taxation has become a very important area. But I think also that the justice system is absolutely quite important, so that when there are disputes, it's important that we have the opportunity to be able to trash those out according to the rules of justice. Importantly, I just kind of felt, looking at this particular matter, that I felt that some of the coverage by the international financial press has also been a bit biased, in a way that Nigeria is being seen as, by taking this decision, as automatically becoming a riskier environment for business, rather than the financial journalists and analysts considering that as a country they have the sovereignty, they have the right to create the laws, those laws, in terms of looking after their own national interests and priorities. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So ratifying is not enough. We need action, we need voices, one voice, one Africa with one voice. We need to strengthen our institutions. We need partners supporting our efforts in our different countries when it comes to what we enforce. And even the private sector, I guess, recognizing that we're trying to fight corruption in our various countries, and how we deal with private sector and how they deal with their business. Let me just move this side.
Your right hand exists.
Sorry? I'm going to move this side.
Okay.
Okay, for now. Yes. Let me start in front here, and then we'll go to Sefalana. Yes, sir.
Merci. Je m'appelle Essohana Wiao. Je suis magistrat, président de la Haute Autorité de prévention de lutte contre la corruption du Togo. Puisque c'est la première fois que je prends la parole, je voudrais ajouter ma voix à celles qui m'ont précédé, notamment celle de mon collègue du Bénin, pour exprimer mes remerciements aux autorités botswanaises et aux organisateurs de notre dialogue. Je voudrais aussi féliciter tous les panélistes qui se sont succédés depuis 3 jours pour la pertinence de leurs propos. J'ai une soif que je voudrais exprimer en m'adressant non seulement au panel, surtout au sommité de l'architecture africaine de gouvernance. Je suis très heureux de constater que 15 ans après l'adoption de la Convention panafricaine et face à la persistance du phénomène, nous avons amélioré le vocabulaire. Il n'est plus question simplement de prévenir et de lutter contre la corruption, mais il est désormais question de la vaincre pour placer l'Afrique sur une voie de développement durable. Alors, je voudrais m'assurer que nous ne partirons pas d'ici les mains vides, les valises vides, mais que nous partirons avec des déclarations, des recommandations, des résolutions, en tout cas un paquet de stratégies destinées à vaincre la corruption sur notre continent. Je vous remercie.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you very much. My name is Sefalna Lobelo, and I represent Botswana Center for Public Integrity. Highlighting to the conversation, especially what Mr. Ward had said in the conversation of illicit financial flows, my contribution is Africa is a very rich continent, and when it comes to natural resources. And it is imperative that in the fight against corruption, we focus immensely in this and make, because it is a continent that makes billions, therefore billions are easily lost. It is imperative that we understand how these resources are extracted, who gets the tenders and the processing of these resources and why, because not a lot of people are informed about this sector, and therefore there's a lot of room for corruption to breed. It is crucial that institutions against corruption work closely with stakeholders in these sectors to assess the terms and conditions about to assess the terms and conditions of how exactly do they intend to be transparent. So I believe scrutinizing very carefully how the processing of the natural resources, the extractive industries should be something that we all take a stand to focus on so we can save a lot of billions within this continent. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. Okay, the gentleman in the white shirt at the back, your comment, please make it 2 minutes, then we'll go to questions after that.
Thank you so much.
After that, yes.
Yeah. My name's Buba Khan. I work with ActionAid International. And I would like to talk on the issue of partnerships. I think it's very important for us to be able to get across to a lot of these issues, especially around the illicit financial flows. I think we need to leverage on each other's capacity so that we can be able to tackle the issue at hand in terms of who has the comparative advantage and what support can we render to each other in this. And in this, I think we call on both the state and non-state actors to be able to work together, both intra and inter. As you said, civil society find it difficult to work among themselves. They compete, they duplicate, they do a lot of stuff. But oftentimes, government also is difficult to be able to work with, because recently we've seen shrinking political space for civil society participation. How can we be able to work effectively in this environment that civil society are not trusted, they are not given the space to be able to do their work as effectively as possible? Someone mentioned the source of funding for civil society. I think this is a lot more hypocritical, because which government in Africa would tell us that they are not receiving funding from Europe or elsewhere? So I think the bottom line is, how do we use those resources and how do we coordinate our affairs so that we can be able to articulate those issues collectively? It's no man's job to be able to do all this. We have to humble ourselves and know that in partnership, there is a lot of room for improvement. And it boils down to mutual accountability. We find it difficult to get information from governments in the guise of secrecy and confidentiality. How do you know when contracts are signed? And that's where the deals happen. And that's where capacity gaps are. So we need to interrogate those things so that we can be able to find space, to add value to what is happening. But, I think where we need to go is the information bills in countries need to be ratified so that civil society could have access to those information. And lastly, Madam Chair, is on the issue of trust. Government needs to trust civil society so that we can work in unison. And then again, governance, there is a mention of some countries that are in instability, and there is a strong correlation between governance and corruption in this aspect, because a lot of time, those countries in crisis are often very vulnerable, and you see corruption strive because there are other players that are there to tap the natural resources as the crisis is going on. So we need to be able to champion, in this case, the ACDEC, the African Charter on Democracy, Elections, and Governance. Because it's an important tool that this August gathering need to be able to promote so that we can get to, where we want to. Otherwise, if we don't get the governance right, we might not be able to do that.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, gentleman at the back, yes.
OK, thank you very much. Mon nom est Komlan Messi. Je vais switcher entre le français et l'anglais. Donc, vous pouvez mettre vos casques maintenant, s'il vous plaît. Mon nom est Komlan Messi. Je suis le secrétaire général du FOSCAO, le Forum de la société civile de l'Afrique de l'Ouest, WACSOF, West African Civil Society Forum. I kind of disagree with the person who is on your left, Madam Chair. He said that there was a kind of fatalism that donor will always exist, etc. I think that can be reduced somehow, because if we don't create value, we don't create economic development in Africa, we won't have our own foundations that will fund our civil society organizations. So it is important to stimulate economic development, innovation, entrepreneurship in Africa, so we will have big companies that will create big foundations that can finance and fund African civil society organizations, and that will bring to a kind of autonomy for the civil society organizations. And again, civil society organizations are a friend of government. They shouldn't be afraid. Government should not take them as enemy. One other thing is about the tax justice. There should be a tax justice between small companies and big companies. S'il n'y a pas de justice entre les petites compagnies et les grandes compagnies, l'argent va fuir. Donc ça, c'est quelque chose que la personne qui est à votre gauche, qui représente l'association des administrations de taxes, je pense que c'est important de pouvoir taxer de façon juste les organisations, parce que ce sont les taxes qui créent la valeur pour les gouvernements. Alors, merci beaucoup. Je vais m'arrêter là-bas.
Thank you very much. We are almost running behind time. I don't know if the panelists have something to say or add to the comments, not the questions. We'll take questions afterwards, if you have anything to say or add.
Thank you. I think the speakers have expounded views that one cannot disagree with, and I appreciate all the comments. And I think maybe just to say that on the issue of Nigeria and the MTN example, there's a further example. I think it was President Magavule who put an assessment on a mining company, and the world also regarded him as mad. And what we didn't know is that in Tanzania and part of Zambia, some of the mining companies did not only, they are copper mining companies. And they, unlike other places, didn't melt the copper and export it. They took the earth that they dug out of the mines and put that on the boats, and said they're going to process and melt it somewhere else. In the meantime, what was discovered after many years is that in that earth that they took, telling the government it's copper, inside that was not only copper, there was uranium and platinum and all sorts of other things, which they basically stole because it was not declared. And so, taking all of that into consideration, the government put on an assessment, and the world also called it, like Tagbo explained, an unstable economic environment. But unless we take actions that shows our willingness to protect our economies, we are not going to be taken seriously. And without speaking about the merits of the MTN case or the merits of the extractive case in Tanzania, I think the message there is that governments mustn't be scared to act, because other governments in the north do that and nothing happens to them. They will criticize, they will sanction, but you've got to grit your teeth and do it so that your other fellow Africans can follow. That's the way we're going to protect our base. Maybe just to also say that issues around transparency in the extractive industries is critically important, and civil society here, and more critically, some of the work that Tax Justice Network Africa is doing, enabling parliamentarians to understand this, also brings it, into the institutional domain, and that's a critical fight, because that is where most of the losses occur. And then, of course, with regards to civil society, one cannot underplay or overestimate the role that civil society plays in this, but it has to stop competing. It has to find an agenda that makes it contribute statistically, structurally and functionally with results, and that will make its role a lot more potent. Thank you.
Alvin?
Thank you. Try to be very brief. Two comments. One, I think there was a comment from the colleague from, I don't know if it's from SAD, yes, about citizens not paying tax, that only, yes, from SAD. I wish to differ with that. The recent statistics from the Africa Tax Outlook of 2018 indicates that of the total revenue generation, value added, which is a consumption tax, contributes over 40% in average. So the perception that the only taxpayer is the one who is in the pay, I think we need to move away from that, because that also contributes to creating a perception that I am only a taxpayer if I'm in the formal economy. There were recent statistics in Kenya, for instance, that showed that Kenya has a population of about 45 million, and of that only 2.9 million are in formal employment. And of those 2.9, 75% earn less than $500. So what that communicates, you would make the assumption that those are the non-taxpayers, or those operating in the informal economy are not taxpayers. I think particularly when you consider that the growing contribution of value added and consumption taxes, it's something that we need to look into. And then I think that we are seeing trends across the continent of leaders being more forceful when it comes to calling some of the activities of these companies to account. We saw in Uganda, where with the support, I think, from ETAF, where the government took tallow oil to court to protest their decision to move their residents from to Mauritius to avoid paying capital gains tax, and they took them to court and were successful. And I think they, as a result of that, the Ugandan government got $450 million. As a result of that, we are seeing similar cases in Tanzania with the Acacia, where the government has come very forcefully saying you have not been paying taxes over this period, and we are demanding that back. And the example from Nigeria is a case. So I think that there are opportunities for our leadership to be more forceful in terms of demanding that these companies pay their rightful share of tax.
Thank you very much, Alvin and Logan. We shall take a few questions before we go for lunch. And I'll start this side. Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Make it short. Don't just ask
I'll
questions.
make it short, yeah, thank you. My question is about who is going to police the donor agencies? Donor agencies have got their own programs, and sometimes they are not in alliance with our national agenda. So, as we were speaking, I just got a message that the Sky News reported that UNHCR used money that were meant for refugees in South Sudan, in Uganda, to spend on Ugandan government officials. This was money meant to support the refugees from South Sudan who are in Uganda. So who is going to police these big shots?
Okay, who's going to police the big shots, Mr. Hoffman? And then the gentleman behind Mr. Hoffman afterwards.
Thank you very much. My question relates to illicit financial flows out of Africa, which amount to the rape of the economy. Why has nobody at the AU suggested to governments in Africa that are losing tax revenue on the financial flows that are illicit to sue the companies involved in those illicit flows for the tax that has not been paid on those flows? It could be a lot of money.
Thank you very much. The gentleman behind,
yes. Merci, madame. Je viens du Togo. Je voudrais, par rapport à la problématique sur laquelle nous discutons, madame, féliciter tous les panélistes qui ont vraiment abordé tous les aspects avec des propositions concrètes pour agir sur le vol de notre argent. En fait, c'est de ça il est question. Alors, mon commentaire va dans le sens de renforcer ce qu'un panéliste a dit, à savoir que nous devons travailler à la fois pour renforcer les capacités techniques et à la fois pour renforcer les capacités structurelles. Je crois que c'est un pas important. Moi, je travaille dans le domaine de l'eau. Eh bien, j'ai l'habitude de dire que lorsque je réalise un forage, je peux tromper quelqu'un. Je peux tromper la population que mon forage a une profondeur, peut-être, exemple, de 100 mètres. Qu'en réalité, le forage a une profondeur de 50 mètres. Et voilà comment les jeux se jouent, à la fois dans le domaine de l'exploitation des eaux, à la fois dans l'exploitation donc des mines, etc., etc. Et donc, comme on l'a dit, eh bien, le calcul des taxes est tributaire vraiment de données réelles. Si on parle de l'eau, quel est le volume qui soit exploité? Quand on parle des mines, idem, etc., etc. Alors, comme ça, je disais tout à l'heure que je pousse l'idée de celui-là qui dit « Ah oui, travaillons sur les capacités ». Je crois que quelqu'un a cité l'exemple donc de l'Afrique du Sud qui a un bureau. Moi, je pense que nos États, je voudrais renforcer ça, nos États doivent se doter vraiment des structures spécifiques, professionnelles et thématiques. Doter donc des ressources humaines qualifiées et de tous les moyens nécessaires pour pouvoir aider nos États à s'assurer réellement de ce qui est prévu ou de ce qui est prélevé par les entreprises multinationales dont nous parlons. Et aussi s'organiser au niveau donc de la vente. Vous êtes sans savoir que pour le moment, nos matières premières sont vendues hors du continent. Là aussi, il faut s'organiser pour savoir réellement le coût de vente, parce que c'est ça aussi qui va permettre naturellement de poser une base de calcul réel de ce qui est prélevé
Merci.
et de ce qui est vendu.
Merci
beaucoup.
Madame. Merci beaucoup. OK. Des questions, s'il vous plaît? Que des questions? OK. Monsieur.
I'd like to ask Mr. Logan Ward, what is the of the African Union Convention on Anti-Corruption in do? Does it play any role? And secondly, you mentioned a lot of things you have done in different countries, and through a mechanism which is non-binding, like the African Tax Administration Forum. So I'd like to get your opinion, like this non-binding mechanism network versus a binding mechanism like the AU African Union Convention Against Corruption. This is it in terms of finding which are the most relevant, efficient ways of fighting corruption in the continent and the different instruments available.
Thank you very much. That's 4 questions. Evan, pick one relevant to you or that you can answer, and yeah, or all of them actually.
Logan, one was directly posed to you, or the last one particularly at least. I'll pick the question on policing agencies. I mean, any bilateral agreement is a mutual. There is 2 countries or 2 entities agree to enter into a mutual agreement, and I think that should be the basis. If there's any kind of policing, that would be the basis I would see, which is a mutual accountability arrangement. On the question of suing companies, this is an interesting proposal. As a matter of fact, actually, my organization, we have a court case going on where we have sued the Kenyan government on the double tax agreement that they have signed with Mauritius. The tricky part I see is that the conversation around illicit financial flows has a lot of gray area. If you look at where tax avoidance and tax evasion, where one starts and one ends, makes from a purely legal dimension very difficult. But that's not to say some of the cases are not going. I know that there have been cases where, like the example that was given in the case of Nigeria, that was an example of a country that has taken legal measures against a particular entity. So I don't think that there's going to be a summary suit. We are suing against the 50 billion. It has to be contextually on a case-by-case basis where you feel as a country you have sufficient evidence to prove either in a national court or an international court that there has been a law that has been broken. Recently, Tanzania, for example, decided not to be a member of the International Arbitration Court because they felt that these spaces are usually to its own disadvantage, so making decisions on their own national courts. So in general, to summarize it, I think that there has been specific efforts by individual companies, by individual countries against individual companies. There has not been an AU process, and I'm struggling to understand how that can happen, because that would mean all countries approaching one court against 3,000 cases. That would be a little bit impractical. On the question of technical capacity, I fully agree that technical capacity is really an important component in the fight against illicit financial flows, and the work that has been done by ETAF that is targeting revenue officials. We are working jointly with ETAF in building capacity of members of parliament. We do have programs that target the media, which we feel is really, really important in terms of shaping the narrative, exposing some of the activities of some of these companies. We have programs that target civil society organizations. In general, I think that we need to think about capacity building across the value chain in the different policy-making spaces on this agenda. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Logan.
Thank you. To come to the question that was directed directly. ITAV doesn't particularly have in our convention a specific link to the AU Convention on Anti-Corruption. But the issue about the non-binding conventions that you were talking about, the bigger context of the world of taxation is that in the end, tax is a sovereign matter. And there isn't a world body or an African body that sets standards on what tax rates must be or what tax laws must be. What happens globally, and we don't have that on the continent, it's largely the OECD that does it for their countries and kind of imposes it on everybody else in a, I'm saying this politely, is that it discusses situations where countries must avoid harmful tax practices against each other and what they call the race to the bottom in order to get investment because everybody loses. And then it discusses transactions, international transactions that causes countries to lose money. And in these negotiations, which often takes the form of tax treaties, you're basically there to defend your share of revenue. Because of the globalization of trade, the battle today about taxation is what percentage of the tax do you get? And if Africa doesn't get its act together and speak with one voice, we're going to get the least. And the AU does not have, at a tax level, a platform where African governments get together and say, let's talk about our tax laws, let's talk about our tax competition. That doesn't exist. What we find with our model conventions on tax treaties, we've got one on transfer pricing, we've got one on interest deductibility, we've got a mutual administrative assistance agreement, which means countries can send tax inspectors to each other and help each other do investigations. Those things are voluntarily signed. We find that when people voluntarily sign conventions, it means they're going to do it. If they politically sign a convention because it is expected, it doesn't mean they're going to extradite a criminal. And so we find that the voluntary space probably gives far better compliance to a convention than the forced space. On the question of, in addition to Alvin's answer on why don't you sue companies, the issue is a matter of evasion and avoidance. Avoidance is the biggest part of the loss. The tool against avoidance, you cannot sue against avoidance because avoidance happens within the framework of what the law allows you. And so when Tagbo speaks about MTN and the structures, that was possible because Nigeria changed one thing in their international law. They changed what is called the onus of proof. In the past, the government had to prove transactions of a company. It was impossible. So they got away with things. Now companies must prove their transactions, and that is what makes it possible. And so when countries like Tanzania, South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya start taking action, whether you call it suing or whether you're calling it legally pursuing revenue that is due, they do that not because of numbers of an illicit financial flow in general, Mr. Hoffman. They do that because they have built-in defenses in their domestic tax environment. So our action doesn't lie out there. Our actions lies within ourselves. So we need to have transfer pricing legislation, interest deductibility legislation. We have to have a couple of rules, and then we have to have IT systems. And then we must invest in the people that must manage those IT systems. So yes, we must invest, we must have the political will, we must pass the laws. The defense mechanisms against tax avoidance doesn't lie with anyone else. It lies with your country, your Ministry of Finance, and within your laws. And that is the defense for our losses. It lies within ourselves.
It lies within ourselves. And Ibrahim is walking towards the stage. And with that, for those who couldn't comment or ask questions, I apologize. It is lunchtime. So I'll hand over to Ibrahim. Thank you very much.
I think we can do better than that. Let's put our hands together once more. I think we have tried in the last 5 sessions since yesterday to provide answers to almost all the issues that we would want to talk about when we talk about corruption on the continent. And I was very pleased with even the reception and the comments we were getting about this particular session even long before it finished, because it almost brought together all the points that were raised as it relates to the international collaboration and cooperation needed to fight corruption on the continent. And so I want to say a very big thank you to our panel and the moderator for a very beautiful session. And we've done our best as a Secretariat to capture many of the very useful recommendations that came, of course, from the panel, but also from the floor. So once again, I say let's give a warm round of applause to the panel. Thank you very much. We will break for lunch now, and we'll reconvene at 3 o'clock. That is also to give us enough time to clean the outcome statements and prepare for the last session before the closing ceremony. Ladies and gentlemen, enjoy lunch and see you at 3 o'clock. Thank you. I'm in the middle of the program, Jerome. Let Rizan undo all the details.